Chapter 1. The Garden Party at Willowmead. The afternoon sun lay like a warm blanket over the village of Little Whittington, softening the sharp lines of hedges and thatched rooftops, gilding the rose bushes in the vicarage garden. In the grand lawn of Willowmead, a sprawling Georgian house on the green, tables had been set out with crisp white cloths and china teacups that clinked merrily in the breeze. It was the annual garden party for the local Ladies' Preservation Society, an event not to be missed even by those with little interest in preserving anything beyond their own reputations. Miss Marple, dressed in a sensible straw hat and a pale lilac dress, sat on a folding chair beneath a wide chestnut tree, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Her blue eyes, sharp as ever despite her 70-odd years, missed nothing, not the forced laughter between Mrs. Cranley and Mrs. Stooks, nor the barely concealed eye-roll young Iris Cranley gave her mother behind her parasol. "It's all quite lovely, isn't it, Miss Marple?" beamed Mrs. Penelope Barton, a brisk woman with a decided chin and a fondness for organising raffles. She fluttered into the chair beside her. "We've sold every ticket. Lady Carradine herself donated the prize for the tombola. A most exquisite antique comb." Miss Marple smiled politely. "An amber comb, I believe you said." Yes, from the East or somewhere very exotic," Mrs. Barton said, lowering her voice confidentially. "It was found in her late husband's things. Dreadful tragedy that, boating accident, terrible business." Miss Marple murmured appropriately, but made no further comment. Experience had taught her that people often revealed more if one simply knitted and listened. Across the lawn, the tombola booth had drawn a respectable crowd. The comb itself was displayed under a glass dome on a velvet cushion. A striking piece, glinting rich gold and marbled with deep, burnt orange veins. It had a curious, almost hypnotic quality. Lady Carradine, a tall, angular woman with commanding cheekbones and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, presided over the stall with visible pride. A shriek of laughter from the young people interrupted the hum of conversation. Iris Cranley, willowy and dark-haired, had caught the eye of Captain Michael Arkwright, home from service abroad, and they now flirted shamelessly under the watchful gaze of Mrs. Cranley. Several of the older ladies tutted behind their napkins, but Miss Marple merely smiled to herself. She had once been young too, after all, though she doubted she had ever been so careless with her admirers. "Numbers 36 and 42, please," called Lady Carradine briskly, holding aloft 2 slips. A short, harried-looking woman with sharp features bustled forward to claim one prize, a modest silver picture frame. Miss Marple recognised her, Miss Edith Preece, the new librarian, who had taken up her post just 3 months ago. She lived quietly in one of the small stone cottages behind the High Street, and had so far succeeded in ruffling quite a few feathers by insisting the parish reading room be modernised. As for the second winning number, no one immediately came forward. Lady Carradine frowned and rechecked the slip. 42? Anyone holding ticket number 42? A stir rippled through the gathering. Then Captain Arkwright stepped forward, a wry smile on his tanned face. "I believe that's me," he said, producing the ticket from his breast pocket. "Though I can't say I expected to win anything more than sunburn today." A ripple of laughter. went through the crowd as Lady Carradine lifted the glass dome and carefully presented the amber comb to him. "You're a fortunate young man," she said, her tone both gracious and proprietary. "It's a rare and precious thing." Captain Arkwright gave a mock bow and tucked the comb into his jacket pocket with exaggerated care. Tea was soon served. Cucumber sandwiches, Battenberg cake, jam tarts gleaming with sticky glaze. And the talk turned back to village matters. The price of eggs, the scarcity of reliable maids, the mystery of why Reverend Stratton's new sermon was rumoured to be about moral decay in Little Whittington. It was just after the second pot of Darjeeling had been poured that the trouble began. A sharp cry rang out near the tombola table. The crowd turned instinctively toward it, some clutching their teacups, others freezing mid-sentence. It was Lady Carradine, her face pale, one gloved hand pressed to her chest. "The comb!" she gasped. It's gone!" There was a stunned silence. Captain Arkwright, looking confused, reached for his pocket, only to find it empty. He patted himself down, frowning deeply. "I swear I had it just—" A few of the younger ladies shrieked, and an excited buzz spread through the garden like a brush-fire. The comb, the precious antique comb, had vanished without a trace. Within minutes the garden party had dissolved into a chaos of chatter, accusations, and indignant protests. Mr. Truick, the village constable, who had been enjoying a de Bédieu quiet afternoon with a scone, was hastily summoned. "Very serious matter, very serious indeed," he muttered, pulling out a small notepad. Lady Carradine, still trembling, insisted that she had seen the comb safely handed to Captain Arkwright, who maintained just as firmly that he had placed it securely in his jacket. "But you were dancing about with Iris Cranley," Mrs. Stooks pointed out archly. "Could it have fallen out?" Captain Arkwright coloured slightly, but shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm certain it was still there afterwards. I felt it." Miss Marple observed all this. From her seat, her knitting momentarily forgotten, her bright eyes scanned the gathering. The flushed faces, the nervous hands adjusting hats and straightening skirts. The subtle glances exchanged between villagers who just this morning had appeared so comfortably above suspicion. She thought, not for the first time, that wickedness had a curious way of flowering most readily in well-tended places. The comb was gone, but far more than a trinket, Miss Marple suspected, had been stolen this afternoon, and something she knew with a chill of certainty would follow, something far worse than a missing antique. Chapter 2. Whispers across the village by the following. Morning. The theft at Willowmead was the only subject worth speaking of in Little Whittington. In the bakery, Mrs. Fairley clucked over the currant buns and declared it a dreadful scandal. At the greengrocer's, old Mr. Chittock insisted it was a professional job, no doubt the work of a London gang. And outside the post office, Miss Giles, the schoolmistress, confided to Mrs. Truick, wife of the constable, that she had always suspected that Captain Arkwright was too smooth by half. Miss Marple, on her way back from the village with a modest basket of shopping, paused outside the notice board. A new sheet had been posted by Constable Truick. Notice: item stolen during garden party. Reward for information. The modest reward offered was unlikely to tempt anyone who hadn't already been gossiping freely, Miss Marple thought. Information, after all, was little Whittington's second most abundant commodity, after blackberries. She continued home, her footsteps brisk but unhurried. In her mind she sifted through what she had seen: Lady Carradine's pale shock, Captain Arkwright's genuine confusion, the subtle exchanges between others. It was not just the theft that troubled her, it was the air of something hidden, the feeling that, beneath the surface chatter, something had shifted among the villagers. In the parlour of her neat cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple set her shopping aside and brewed a fresh pot of tea. She arranged her Morning Post on the little table by the window, 2 circulars, and a letter from her nephew Raymond, full of literary chatter and complaints about his publisher. Miss Marple opened the window to let in the crisp morning air. Across the way, she could see Mrs. Barton bustling about her roses, her broad hat bobbing with each snip of the secateurs. 2 doors down, Mr. Sims, the retired solicitor, stood conferring earnestly with Mrs. Cranley at her garden gate. It would not be long, Miss Marple reflected, before someone came calling. Sure enough, not 10 minutes later, the latch on her front gate clicked, and a familiar figure appeared. Mrs. Barton, flushed with the excitement of news. "Miss Marple, my dear, I thought I must just pop over. Terrible business yesterday, wasn't it?" Miss Marple laid aside her knitting with a smile. "Do come in, Mrs. Barton. I was just making a second cup." Once seated, Mrs. Barton wasted no time. It's all anyone can talk about. That dreadful theft, and right under Lady Carradine's nose. I do wonder what poor Mr. Truick can do about it. "I'm sure he's doing his best," said Miss Marple mildly, "though these things are seldom straightforward." Mrs. Barton leaned forward, lowering her voice. Between you and me, dear, there's talk that it wasn't just an opportunistic theft. That comb, it's said to be cursed." Miss Marple raised a delicate eyebrow. "Cursed?" Mrs. Barton nodded vigorously. "Oh, yes. Mrs. Stooks says it was, given to Lady Carradine's husband by a woman in Cairo. Some sort of sorceress, I gather, and that it's brought nothing but misfortune ever since. Lady Carradine herself never speaks of it, of course, but some say that's why her husband drowned. Bad luck follows that comb like a shadow." Miss Marple poured the tea carefully. "It's interesting," she said, "how often objects are blamed for what people bring upon themselves." Mrs. Barton laughed nervously and sipped her tea. "Still, it's very odd. And now there's the business with Captain Arkwright." Miss Marple inclined her head encouragingly. "He's vanished," Mrs. Barton said with obvious relish. "Took the early train to London this morning without a word to anyone. Even left his bill unpaid at the inn." "How very sudden," Miss Marple murmured. "Did anyone see him off? Young Tommy Price works at the station. Says he had only a small suitcase. Looked a bit rough too, dishevelled. Not at all the handsome figure he cut yesterday afternoon." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes, in the excitement of an unexpected event, people make poor choices." Mrs. Barton drained her teacup and rose. "Well, I must be off. So much to do. The preservation. Society is in uproar. Lady Carradine wants an emergency meeting this evening." After she departed, Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded over her knitting. She had no reason yet to disbelieve Captain Arkwright's confusion at the garden party. And flight, as she well knew, was not always a sign of guilt. Sometimes it was fear, or worse, shame. As she pondered, another visitor arrived, young Iris Cranley herself, in a flurry of white muslin and nervous energy. "Miss Marple," she said, almost breathless. "I don't know who else to talk to. You see, it's about Michael, Captain Arkwright." Miss Marple gestured to the chair. "Sit down, my dear." Iris obeyed, twisting her handkerchief between slim fingers. "It's just he wouldn't have stolen anything. I know he wouldn't. But everyone's saying, and Mamma is furious. She says I've been utterly foolish, encouraging him." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You were fond of him." Iris blushed. Perhaps. He was different, not like the others here. He talked about the world, about Africa, about the future. "And now you fear he has been maligned," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes," Iris burst out. "I don't believe he took that comb, but there's something else. Last night after the party, I saw someone near the tombola table." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Who?" Iris hesitated. "I'm not sure. It was dark. I only saw a figure crouched down by the prize table. When they saw me coming, they slipped away, quickly. Man or woman, I couldn't tell. They wore dark clothes. That's all I remember." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "And you didn't think to mention it at once?" "I didn't realize. I thought it might have been one of the committee tidying up. And then when the comb was found missing, and everyone was accusing Michael, I didn't know what to do. You did the right thing coming here," said Miss Marple. Outside, a clock struck 12, its chimes bright and musical. Somewhere farther. Down Church Lane, a dog barked. Miss Marple looked at Iris's stricken face and made up her mind. She would go to the Preservation Society meeting that evening and listen carefully, for in her experience the truth rarely announced itself. It slipped between the lines of conversation, hid itself in casual remarks, and only the keenest observer could hope to catch it. And already she had the distinct feeling that the theft of the amber comb was merely the beginning. Chapter 3. Shadows at Willowmead. The drawing-room at Willowmead was crowded by the time Miss Marple arrived that evening. Heavy brocade curtains muffled the fading light, and the scent of beeswax polish clung to the air. The Preservation Society members, resplendent in their best hats and sternest expressions, perched uneasily on upright chairs hastily arranged around the room. At the centre of it all, like a spider, at the heart of its web, sat Lady Carradine. She wore deep plum silk, her hair pulled tight against her skull, a diamond brooch gleaming coldly at her throat. Her sharp gaze swept the gathering with an air of controlled disdain. Miss Marple quietly slipped into a seat near the door, her knitting bag tucked neatly under one arm. She greeted Mrs. Barton with a nod, and received a whisper in return. "She's furious, wants action, talks of hiring a private investigator if the police don't move faster." Before Miss Marple could respond, Lady Carradine rose to her feet. "Ladies," she said, her voice clipped and precise, "you are all aware of the disgrace that has befallen our community. An item of great personal and historical value has been stolen under our very noses. During an event meant to promote civility and refinement." The several ladies shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Cranley tutted under her breath. I have spoken to Constable Truick," Lady Carradine continued, "and while he assures me the matter is being investigated, I fear that swift and decisive action is necessary if we are to protect the reputation of Little Whittington, and indeed our own good names." There was a murmured agreement, though more out of duty than passion. It was one thing to gossip about scandal, quite another to have one's own conduct questioned in the newspapers. Miss Marple observed Lady Carradine with interest. There was an intensity behind her words, a strain in the set of her shoulders. Pride wounded, yes, but something more. Fear, perhaps. "I propose," Lady Carradine said, "that we offer a larger reward, and if necessary, we may retain the services of a professional inquiry agent from London." At this, a ripple of unease passed through the room. The idea of an outsider poking into Little Whittington's affairs was not a welcome one. Mrs. Barton raised a tentative hand. "But surely, Lady Carradine, if Captain Arkwright is responsible, and it does seem very suggestive, his sudden departure, and then the matter is nearly settled?" Miss Marple noticed the brief tightening of Lady Carradine's lips. "Appearances can be misleading," Lady Carradine said sharply. "Until the item is recovered, no conclusion can be drawn." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Lady Carradine, it seemed, was not nearly as eager to blame Captain Arkwright as some might assume. "I wonder," Miss Marple said aloud, her voice mild and unthreatening, "whether the comb itself might offer a clue?" All heads turned toward her. Lady Carradine's eyes narrowed slightly. "In what way, Miss Marple?" she asked. "Such objects often have a history," Miss Marple said, clicking her knitting needles gently. "Stories, associations. Perhaps the person who took it did so not for its value alone, but because of something personal." There was a silence, and then Mrs. Stooks exclaimed, "You mean revenge, or some old grudge?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "Only that motives are rarely as simple as they appear." Lady Carradine sat back in her chair, regarding Miss Marple thoughtfully. "An interesting theory, Miss Marple, though I hope we are not about to descend into fairy tales about curses and bad luck." Several ladies chuckled nervously, and the tension in the room eased slightly. It was agreed, somewhat reluctantly, that they would allow Constable Truick a few more days to make inquiries before engaging outside help. The meeting broke up soon after, with much fluttering of scarves and whispered side conversations. Miss Marple did not hurry away. She lingered near a low bookshelf, ostensibly admiring the collection of botanical prints on the wall. "Miss Marple," Lady Carradine said quietly, approaching her, "you seem to have a knack for insights." Miss Marple smiled. "Only the observation of human nature, Lady Carradine. One learns a great deal in a long life." Lady Carradine hesitated. "I should tell you, the comb was not simply valuable. It was part of a collection my husband assembled abroad. He prized it excessively." Her mouth twisted bitterly. "It caused considerable discord between us." "I'm sorry to hear that," Miss Marple said gently. Lady Carradine gave a short, mirthless laugh. "The past has a way of clinging, Miss Marple, like cobwebs in an old house, difficult to brush away." Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. "Sometimes it is precisely the thing most clung to that becomes the source of trouble." Lady Carradine studied her a moment longer. then nodded curtly and swept away to attend to her other guests. Outside Willowmead, the evening air was crisp, tinged with wood smoke. Miss Marple set off down the lane, her mind quietly busy. There were things to consider. The odd reluctance to blame Captain Arkwright too quickly, Lady Carradine's private bitterness, Iris Cranley's frightened confession, the figure seen, lurking at the prize table, and something else, something that tugged at the edge of her thoughts, elusive and persistent. As she neared her own cottage, she caught sight of a figure waiting by her gate. It was Edith Priest, the librarian, looking more nervous than ever, clutching her worn leather handbag tightly. "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, might I have a word?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, opening the gate. "Come in. We'll have a cup of cocoa, and you can tell me everything." Because Miss Marple, who had seen more of the darker shades of human behaviour than her gentle appearance suggested, knew that when people came seeking her advice at night, it was rarely for anything simple. And as she ushered Edith inside, she suspected, no, she knew, that the theft of the amber comb was merely the surface of a deeper, more dangerous current swirling beneath little Whittington's tranquil facade. Chapter 4. First suspect is Miss Marple's cosy sitting. Room. The fire crackled gently, casting a soft golden glow across the familiar surroundings. Edith Priest perched uncomfortably on the edge of an armchair, her handbag clutched so tightly that her knuckles shone white. Miss Marple, calm and composed, set down a tray with 2 cups of cocoa and a plate of digestive biscuits. "There now, my dear," she said kindly. "No need to be nervous. Tell me what's troubling you." Edith hesitated then, as if the act of sitting safely within these walls loosened her tongue. The words tumbled out. "It's about the garden party, Miss Marple, about the comb." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Yes." "Dame saw something," Edith whispered. "I didn't think much of it at the time. I wasn't even sure it meant anything. But with Captain Arkwright gone, and everyone talking—" Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Edith drew a trembling breath. "I saw Mrs. Cranley near the tombola table, after the prizes had been awarded. She was bending over, very close to the table, and when she stood up, she looked flustered. I thought perhaps she was picking up a dropped handkerchief or something." Miss Marple sipped her cocoa thoughtfully. "And you did not mention this to the constable?" Edith flushed. "I didn't want to cause trouble. Mrs. Cranley is important, and I thought perhaps it was nothing. But now—" She broke off, twisting the strap of her handbag miserably. "You did the right thing, Miss Priest," Miss Marple said gently. "Truth often hides behind small, seemingly unimportant moments." Edith's shoulders sagged with relief. "Have you told anyone else?" "No, only you." Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. "Very wise. It is better sometimes to observe quietly until the right moment." Edith rose to leave, and Miss Marple saw her out with a reassuring smile. But once the door closed, and she returned to her chair, her expression grew thoughtful. Mrs. Cranley. It was an interesting name to have surfaced. Agnes Cranley was one of the village's most prominent figures, a widow of considerable means and even more considerable pride. She was the sort of woman who saw the preservation of appearances as a sacred duty. for her to be seen acting suspiciously near the scene of the theft, and to have said nothing, was, at the very least, intriguing. Miss Marple turned it over in her mind. Mrs. Cranley's daughter, Iris, had been growing increasingly rebellious. Her open flirtation with Captain Arkwright had caused considerable gossip. Might Mrs. Cranley have had a motive connected not to the comb itself, but to the scandal brewing around her daughter? The next day, the village buzzed with a new rumour. A silver compact belonging to Iris Cranley had also gone missing. At the bakery, Mrs. Fairley shook her head over the loaves. First the comb, now a compact. Mark my words, there's a thief among us. At the post office, Miss Giles whispered behind her ledger, "It's that captain, you'll see. Soldiers pick up all sorts of bad habits abroad." Miss Marple listened, quietly, noting what was said and what was not. No one mentioned Mrs. Cranley. Not yet. That afternoon, Constable Truick made an official call at Willowmead, and the villagers speculated wildly about whether an arrest was imminent. Miss Marple, for her part, spent the time writing a letter to her nephew and pruning her roses, seemingly oblivious to the growing frenzy. It was early evening when she received an unexpected visit from Mr. Sims, the retired solicitor. He was a neat man with a pinched face and a tendency to pontificate. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course, Mr. Sims," Miss Marple said pleasantly, leading him to the garden bench, where the lavender smelled sweet and calming. "I've been thinking," he said, seating himself stiffly, "about the matter of the comb." "Indeed?" Miss Marple prompted. "Yes, I recall something rather curious. At last year's summer fete I happened to overhear a conversation between Lady Carradine and Mrs. Cranley, about the comb, as it happens." He adjusted his cuffs fussily. "Lady Carradine was offering it as a donation even then, but Mrs. Cranley seemed opposed, said it was unwise to dredge up old misfortunes." "Curious indeed," Miss Marple murmured. Mr. Sims nodded sagely. "Precisely my thought." Mrs. Cranley appeared almost agitated, highly unusual for a woman of her poise. One would think the comb had some special meaning to her. Miss Marple thanked him warmly, and after Mr. Sims departed, she sat a long while among her roses, thinking. Mrs. Cranley's opposition, her suspicious behaviour near the tombola table, her daughter's growing entanglement with a man like Captain Arkwright, and now the disappearance of Iris's compact, a sentimental item, no doubt. If Mrs. Cranley had taken the comb, it was unlikely to have been for monetary gain. No, it would be for protection. Protection of family, of reputation, of secrets. And yet Miss Marple's instincts warned her it would be unwise to settle too quickly. Village life taught one that even the clearest appearances could be deceptive. The real solution, she knew, was likely to be far more tangled. The following day, news spread quickly. Lady Carradine had received a letter, unsigned, offering to return the comb, for a price, £50, to be left under the old elm tree at the edge of the village green by sunset. The village, already simmering with gossip, now boiled over a blackmail, cried Mrs. Barton, fluttering into the vicarage. "Common criminals!" thundered Reverend Stratton from the pulpit. Even Mr. Sims, usually so measured, was overheard proclaiming that little Whittington was going to the dogs. Miss Marple listened to it all, her knitting growing steadily under her hands. Blackmail changed everything. The thief was not simply someone driven by greed or sentiment. They were willing to use fear and risk exposure for profit. It narrowed the field considerably. Miss Marple thought again of Mrs. Cranley. Proud, certainly. Protective, undoubtedly. But blackmail? No, that suggested someone else. Someone more desperate, someone willing to exploit old secrets for new gain. And so, as the sun dipped low over the hedgerows and the appointed hour drew near, Miss Marple prepared herself to observe, quietly, unobtrusively, the scene at the elm tree. Because in her long experience, those who thought themselves clever enough to deceive others were often most careless. At the moment they believed victory was within their grasp. And already, Miss Marple could sense it. The village was on the cusp of another darker revelation. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The old elm tree stood alone on the village green, its broad, gnarled branches arching like weary arms over the withered grass beneath. At sunset, the green was usually a place of quiet. A dog walker here, a cyclist there. But tonight, unseen eyes peered from hedges and behind curtained windows. The whole of Little Whittington, it seemed, was holding its breath. Miss Marple, discreet as always, had chosen her vantage point carefully. From a bench, half hidden by an overgrown privet hedge, she had a clear view of the elm without drawing attention to herself. A light shawl over her shoulders, her knitting on her lap. She might have been merely enjoying the last of the evening warmth. On the green, Constable Truick paced nervously, trying and failing to appear casual. He was not a man naturally suited, to subterfuge. At precisely 7 o'clock, as arranged, Lady Carradine's housekeeper, a solid woman named Mrs. White, approached the tree. She glanced left and right, then, with deliberate movements, placed a small brown parcel at the base of the trunk before hurrying away. The green grew quiet again. The village seemed to hold its breath. Minutes passed, long, aching minutes during which nothing stirred but the slow creep of evening mist. Then a shadow detached itself from the far side of the green. Miss Marple's needles paused. The figure was slim, quick, darting from cover to cover. Not the movements of someone, entirely at ease. Nearer and nearer it crept toward the elm. For a heartbeat, Miss Marple caught a clearer glimpse. A flash of light hair, a hunched posture, clothes that looked dark against the fading light. The figure reached the tree, bent low, snatched up the parcel, and fled. Constable Truick, alerted too late, gave a startled cry and charged across the green like a startled bullock. But the figure was already melting into the hedgerows and lanes, leaving nothing but rustling shadows in their wake. The chase was brief and futile. Breathless and red-faced, Constable Truick returned to the elm, clutching nothing but his own battered helmet. Miss Marple, meanwhile, folded her knitting calmly and made her way home, her mind alight with possibilities. The figure had been young. She was almost certain of it. Small, nimble and nervous. That narrowed the list considerably. Back at her cottage, she lit a lamp and sat by the window, thinking. There were few in Little Whittington who fit the description. Iris Cranley, of course, but Miss Marple had seen enough of the girl to know she lacked the furtiveness required for such a venture. Tommy Price, the station boy perhaps. Young and full of mischief, but not, she thought, malicious enough to commit blackmail. Another possibility surfaced: Lucy Trent. Lucy was a newcomer, a cousin of Mrs. Barton's, who had come to stay after a disappointing engagement in London. Pretty, clever, and more than a little embittered, Lucy had been seen working the tombola table at the garden party, flirting charmingly with every eligible bachelor, and even some who were not. Miss Marple remembered Lucy's quick smiles, her darting eyes. She was not quite as sweet as she made herself out to be. The next morning brought new developments. Mrs. Barton, bursting with news, caught Miss Marple just as she was returning from morning service. "Oh, Miss Marple! Terrible news! There's been another theft." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Another?" "Yes, Lady Carradine's silver tea service. Vanished in the night. She's absolutely beside herself. Says it's a conspiracy against her." Miss Marple made a soothing sound. "And how did the thief gain entry?" "That's the curious part," Mrs. Barton said, lowering her voice dramatically. "There was no sign of forced entry. No broken locks, no smashed windows. It's as if—" she paused for effect. "As if someone had a key." Miss Marple smiled politely and made her farewells, but inwardly she was thoughtful. No forced entry suggested an insider, someone who had access to the house, or who knew how to gain it. Lady Carradine's staff were loyal by all accounts. Mrs. White had been with her since before her marriage. The gardener was a local lad with no history of trouble. No, it seemed unlikely that the staff were involved. She thought again of Lucy Trent. Mrs. Barton, in her well-meaning way, had paraded her cousin at every available opportunity, and Lady Carradine, fond of young, pretty faces, had invited Lucy to tea not once, but twice since her arrival. Plenty of opportunities to slip away, unnoticed, to observe the house's layout, and perhaps to obtain a key. Miss Marple decided it was time to visit the library. Edith Preece greeted her nervously at the desk, her manner still fluttery from their last conversation. "Miss Marple," she said, have you found anything out?" "Not yet, my dear. But I have hopes." Miss Marple selected a few books at random and settled at a table near the window. From this vantage point, she had a clear view of the lending desk, and of the comings and goings of the village. It was not long before Lucy Trent entered, all smiles and bright chatter. She selected a magazine, giggling with the young man behind the counter, and then, quite casually, leaned across Edith's desk. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. It was not the casual lean that caught her attention. It was Lucy's hand, sliding deftly along the edge of the desk. When Lucy left a few minutes later, Miss Marple rose and approached Edith. "My dear," she said gently, "would you check your desk? Has anything gone missing?" Edith, puzzled, opened the small drawer where she kept the library's petty cash. A moment later, her face blanched. "It's gone," she whispered. "The money's gone." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. There, we'll speak to Constable Truick, quietly. It may be that a pattern is beginning to emerge." She left the library with a new certainty settling in her mind: the theft of the comb, the attempt at blackmail, the missing tea service. Now the petty cash. Someone was growing bolder and more desperate. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but there were still gaps, still shadows where the truth might be hiding. Miss Marple intended to find them, and she suspected she would not have long to wait before the next move was made. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets, days after the theft at the library. Little Whittington was no longer simply whispering about scandal, it was roaring with it. The villagers who had once merely speculated about the theft of the amber comb now spun wild theories involving gangs of thieves, secret lovers, and coded messages hidden inside teapots. Suspicion curled like smoke around every gathering. Miss Marple, however, observed a quieter, more telling shift. At the grocer's, Mrs. Cranley's greeting to Mrs. Barton was clipped, almost cold. At church, Lady Caradine refused to meet the vicar's eye during the sermon. And Lucy Trent, usually bubbling with laughter, was noticeably subdued, her smiles brittle at the edges. Most revealing of all, though, was the silence that had fallen over Iris Cranley. Where once she had flitted about the village like a restless swallow, she now kept to the house, slipping in and out of the vicarage garden at odd hours. Miss Marple had caught sight of her once, sitting alone by the duck pond, shoulders hunched, eyes red from crying. Miss Marple knitted steadily, her mind working faster than her needles. When the invitation arrived for afternoon tea at the vicarage, ostensibly a gathering of the Preservation Society's more concerned members, she accepted with quiet anticipation. The vicarage sitting-room was pleasantly shabby, with faded chintz and a persistent smell of lavender furniture polish. Reverend Stratton, a kindly man of middle years, presided over the tea tray, looking as if he would much rather be anywhere else. Present were Lady Caradine, Mrs. Barton, Mrs. Cranley, Miss Giles, and, at the last moment, Lucy Trent, who slipped in with an apologetic smile and a mumbled excuse about a headache. The conversation was stilted at first, all about the weather and the late roses, but inevitably it circled back to the thefts. "I maintain it's that Arkwright fellow," Mrs. Cranley said sharply, stirring her tea so vigorously it sloshed over the rim. "He may have gone, but his influence remains. Encouraging lax behaviour, undermining morals." Miss Marple said nothing, but she noted the tightness of Mrs. Cranley's mouth, the way she refused to look at Lady Caradine. Lady Caradine, for her part, was oddly quiet, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. It was Lucy who broke the brittle mood, laughing lightly. "Oh, I don't know, Mrs. Cranley. Sometimes bad behaviour is homegrown." There was a moment of shocked silence. Mrs. Cranley flushed a deep, mottled red. "What exactly do you mean by that, young lady?" Lucy gave an innocent shrug. "Only that not all trouble comes from strangers. Sometimes it's right under our noses." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, watched with interest. Lucy's words were too pointed to be casual. The gathering broke up soon after, everyone leaving with tight smiles and muttered goodbyes. Miss Marple lingered behind, helping the vicar stack the cups. "You'll have your work cut out for you this Sunday, Reverend," she said mildly. "Sermons on forgiveness are never easy when the village feels wronged." Reverend Stratton chuckled ruefully. "Indeed, Miss Marple, if only people sought redemption with the same energy they apply to suspicion." As she walked home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lanes, Miss Marple thought carefully about what she had seen. Lucy Trent was playing a dangerous game. Her jibe at Mrs. Cranley had been deliberate. Was she trying to provoke a reaction or cover her own guilt? Miss Marple recalled something her old friend Miss Weatherby used to say. When people boast of what others have done wrong, it's often to draw attention away from what they themselves have to hide. Still, instinct told her Lucy was involved, but perhaps not alone. That evening, as she set out her evening tea, Miss Marple reviewed her mental list of suspects. Mrs. Cranley, fiercely protective of her daughter, perhaps desperate enough to take risks to shield the family name. Lucy Trent, clever, charming, and growing more desperate by the day. Iris Cranley, emotional, impulsive, hiding something. Tommy Price, unlikely, but not impossible. Lady Carradine herself, oddly detached, as if the theft was not entirely unexpected. The pieces of the puzzle were all there. But how did they fit? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. When she answered, she found Iris Cranley on the doorstep, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "please, may I come in?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly, ushering her inside. Iris paced the sitting-room like a trapped bird. "I don't know what to do. I can't sleep. I can't think." Miss Marple waited patiently. Finally, Iris blurted out, "It wasn't Michael. He didn't take the comb." "I know he didn't, and someone's threatening me." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I got a letter," Iris said, pulling a crumpled paper from her pocket. "It says, if I don't stay quiet, they'll tell everyone about something I did." Miss Marple took the letter carefully. The handwriting was rough, disguised, blocky letters that gave away little. "Stay quiet or everyone will know your secret. Think carefully. No signature, no hint of who had sent it." Miss Marple's mind whirred. Blackmail again, but this time aimed at Iris. Someone was desperate to keep her from speaking out. "What is it they threaten to reveal, my dear?" she asked gently. Iris wrung her hands. "It's about money. I took some once, from my mother's purse, months ago. She never found out. But if it came out now, with everything else—" Her voice broke. "She'd disown me." Miss Marple patted her hand soothingly. "You must be brave, my dear. Secrets fester when hidden, and I believe the real danger lies not in what you did, but in who is trying to use it against you." Iris wiped her eyes, looking a little steadier. Miss Marple made her decision then. The time had come for action. Quiet, careful action. But action nonetheless. The real thief was close, very close, and soon, with just the right nudge, they would reveal themselves. Miss Marple smiled kindly at Iris, but behind her placid exterior, her mind sharpened to a fine, deadly point. The village of Little Whittington would not remain in darkness much longer. Chapter 7. Another twist. The next morning dawned misty and cool, the village lanes shrouded in a thin veil that blurred the hedgerows and softened the old stone walls into ghostly outlines. Miss Marple, after seeing Iris safely home the previous evening, rose early, her mind keenly alert. She had seen it many times before, the moment when tension grew so thick that those harbouring guilt could no longer keep still. Secrets had a way of wriggling loose when the air grew too heavy with fear. Sure enough, by mid-morning, another shock rippled through Little Whittington. Lucy Trent was gone. Vanished. Bags packed hurriedly. Her room at Mrs. Barton's neat and empty, save for a half-finished letter of apology and a missing £10 note from Mrs. Barton's kitchen drawer. The village buzzed with the news like a disturbed beehive. "She's fled!" cried Mrs. Barton, close to tears. "Oh, my own cousin! Imagine the shame!" At the post office, Miss Giles clucked sympathetically. "You can never trust these London girls. Always some scandal trailing after them." Constable Truick looked more bewildered than ever. He had been preparing to question Lucy properly, but now, with her disappearance, suspicion hardened quickly in the minds of the villagers. Miss Marple, listening to the rising tide of gossip, did not speak. Lucy's flight complicated matters, and yet, in a way, it also clarified them. For one thing, Lucy had no reason to blackmail Iris. She barely knew her, and Iris's petty theft was not information she could have. Stumbled upon so easily. No! Lucy had been involved in the petty crimes, certainly. The petty cash theft, perhaps even the missing tea service. But the theft of the amber comb and the deeper scheme involved someone else, someone still in Little Whittington, someone who now thought themselves safe. Hidden behind Lucy's sudden disappearance, Miss Marple spent the afternoon quietly calling at several homes under the pretext of checking on various village ladies, bringing a pot of marmalade to Mrs. Truick, a borrowed book to Miss Giles, some knitting wool to Mrs. Barton. At each house she listened, and patterns began to emerge. Mrs. Barton, in her grief, let slip that Lucy had seemed frightened the night before she fled, frightened and eager to leave. Miss Giles, ever observant, recalled that Lucy had met someone, secretly, by the duck pond 2 nights earlier, and Mrs. Cranley, when Miss Marple called at the vicarage garden, was heard arguing fiercely with Iris behind closed doors, her voice strained and furious. "You must stay silent, Iris. Think of our position." Miss Marple, pretending not to hear, admired the marigolds and considered. By tea-time, the rain had come, falling in a steady drumming sheet that forced most of the village indoors. Miss Marple, however, took her umbrella and went walking. The green was deserted. The hedgerows dripped mournfully. Only the crows kept company in the grey sky. She walked toward the duck pond, boots squelching softly in the mud. There, half hidden by a clump of sodden reeds, something glinted. Miss Marple bent carefully, lifting it free. It was a small brooch, delicate, silver, set with tiny pearls. The clasp was broken, as if torn free in haste, and engraved faintly on the back were 2 initials, "I see Iris Cranley." Miss Marple turned the brooch over thoughtfully. Someone had met Lucy here, and someone had lost this brooch. Not Lucy, Iris. Returning home, Miss Marple sat by the fire, drying her shoes and reviewing the facts. Iris had met Lucy. Secretly. Iris, who had been blackmailed. Lucy, who was growing increasingly nervous. What had passed between them? A threat? A plea? Perhaps Lucy had not intended to flee at first. Perhaps she had been persuaded, or frightened, into running. Miss Marple placed the brooch carefully in a small box on her mantelpiece. The next move, she thought, must be hers. The village could not withstand many more shocks before panic and suspicion boiled over into something far uglier. That evening, under the pretext of returning a borrowed recipe book, Miss Marple called at the Cranley house. Mrs. Cranley received her stiffly in the front parlour, the room dark except for a single shaded lamp. Iris was not present. Miss Marple sipped her tea politely and listened to the strange small talk about dahlias and harvest festivals. Then, quite calmly, she set down her cup and said, "I believe, Mrs. Cranley, that your daughter is in danger." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Cranley's hand jerked, sloshing tea onto her lap. She set the cup down with a clatter. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think you do. Someone knows something about Iris, something they are willing to use against her. That makes them dangerous, desperate." Mrs. Cranley sat rigid, her mouth compressed into a thin line. "Your instinct, of course," Miss Marple continued, "is to protect her. That is natural. But silence, Mrs. Cranley, can be just as dangerous as confession." There was a long pause. Finally, Mrs. Cranley whispered, "You don't understand. If it comes out, if people know, Iris will be ruined." Miss Marple's voice softened. Better a little scandal than real harm. Another long moment passed. Then, in a voice heavy with defeat, Mrs. Cranley said, "Iris didn't steal the comb. I swear it. She only wanted to help someone." "Help someone?" Miss Marple echoed. Mrs. Cranley closed her eyes briefly. "Michael Arkwright. She wanted to give him something valuable, something he could sell. She thought, foolishly, that he was in trouble, that he needed to leave the country quickly. She thought she was saving him." Miss Marple's hands were steady as she folded them in her lap. "And so," she said, "she planned to take the comb from the tombola, quietly, and give it to him." Mrs. Cranley nodded miserably. "But someone saw her," Miss Marple said. "Someone who then used the knowledge against her." "Yes." Miss Marple rose, her voice still gentle. "Thank you for trusting me, Mrs. Cranley. I believe we can still put things right." Because now, at last, the true shape of the mystery was beginning to emerge. And Miss Marple, knitting her final deductions together with the precision of a master weaver, knew exactly what she must do next. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The next morning was bright and sharp, the air washed clean by the night's rain. From her sitting-room window, Miss Marple could see the village stirring cautiously to life. Shopkeepers opening shutters, Mrs. Barton bustling to the bakery, Mr. Sims polishing the brass plate on his gate with unnecessary vigour. But Miss Marple had no time to waste on ordinary rhythms today. She had a plan, quiet, unassuming, but carefully laid. A plan to draw the real culprit into the open. At 9:30, she set off for Willowmead. Lady Carradine, summoned by a polite note requesting a word on urgent village matters, received her in the morning room. She looked pale, the strain of recent events tugging at the corners of her mouth, but her voice was steady. "Miss Marple, I hope you have some news." "I believe I do," Miss Marple said pleasantly, settling into a low chair. "The theft of the amber comb, you see, was not quite what it seemed." Lady Carradine stiffened. Miss Marple continued, her voice mild. "There are times when an object becomes less important than the emotions attached to it. Pride, fear, guilt, those things, Lady Carradine, linger far longer than any material possession. Lady Carradine said nothing. Her fingers, however, tightened on the edge of her chair. "I wonder," Miss Marple said softly, "if it is not the theft that has weighed on you most heavily." But the secrets the comb represented, Lady Carradine's breath caught almost imperceptibly. "I have reason to believe," Miss Marple said, knitting her fingers lightly together, "that the person who orchestrated the theft is someone close. Someone who understood the true value of secrecy in Little Whittington." Still silence. Miss Marple leaned back. "I shall be attending a small gathering at the vicarage this evening. A very quiet one. No announcements, no invitations. Just a few villagers and an opportunity." Lady Carradine's face, carved from ice, cracked for the briefest instant, fear flickering behind the steely facade. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her gloves. "You may find it beneficial to join us, Lady Carradine. Truth, after all, has a way of emerging, whether we court it or not." Without waiting for a reply, she took her leave, her expression composed but inwardly tingling with certainty. The trap was set. By 8 o'clock, the sitting-room of the vicarage was modestly full. Miss Marple, Lady Carradine, Mrs. Barton, Reverend Stratton, and Mrs. Cranley. Iris sat quietly by the hearth, her face pale but composed. Constable Truick loitered awkwardly near the sideboard, summoned at Miss Marple's suggestion, but clearly uncomfortable with the gathering's clandestine air. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, waited until tea had been poured, and polite conversation stuttered into an awkward silence. Then she said, in her most innocuous tone, "It's remarkable how small things, tiny details, can unravel the greatest of mysteries." There was a shifting of bodies, a few wary glances exchanged. "For instance," she continued, "a brooch lost by the duck pond, a brown parcel under an elm tree, a petty cash box emptied, seemingly unrelated events. But not so when one knows where to look. Lucy Trent's name was not mentioned, but her shadow loomed large." Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. "And then, of course, there is the amber comb itself. So much more than a simple prize. It represented something deeply personal, something worth stealing or hiding." Lady Carradine's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps the person responsible is here among us now. Perhaps they thought their actions justified, or driven by desperation." She let her words hang in the air, heavy and shimmering with suggestion. It was Mrs. Cranley who broke first. Her voice, brittle with tension, snapped across the room. "If you have something to say, Miss Marple, I suggest you say it plainly." Miss Marple looked at her with the air of a benevolent grandmother. "In good time, Mrs. Cranley. The truth reveals itself most readily when it is gently encouraged." Then she turned her gaze, casually, lightly, to Iris. "I wonder, my dear," she said kindly, "whether you might remember when you attempted to retrieve the comb for Captain Arkwright, did you notice anyone else near the tombola table?" Iris flushed, her hands twisting in her lap. I thought I saw someone, but it was dark and I didn't want to get caught. I just left." Miss Marple nodded. "Fear is a powerful thing. It blinds us." Lady Carradine shifted uneasily. Miss Marple's needles paused. "And yet," she said. "Sometimes fear is not born of guilt, but of shame. Shame at having been used. Shame at having trusted the wrong person." There was a long, breathless moment. Then the door creaked open, and Lucy Trent stepped inside. Gasps echoed around the room. She looked dishevelled but determined, her face pale but set. "I'm sorry," she said into the stunned silence. "I had to come back. I couldn't let it go on." Constable Truex stepped forward, flustered. "Miss Trent, you've a lot to explain." Lucy ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Lady Carradine. "It wasn't me who took the comb," she said fiercely. "I saw who did, and I let them use me to cover it up because I was afraid." Lady Carradine rose stiffly to her feet, her face a mask. "You silly, foolish girl," she said with quiet venom. "Do you know what you're doing?" His voice wavered but held. "Yes, I'm telling the truth." Miss Marple, serene amid the rising storm, said gently, "Perhaps you might tell us exactly what you saw, my dear." Lucy swallowed hard. "I saw Lady Carradine. She took the comb from Captain Arkwright's pocket while he was distracted, flirting with Iris. She hid it under the table, then later slipped it into her own bag." A stunned silence fell over the room. Lady Carradine laughed. A brittle, desperate sound. "And what possible reason would I have to steal my own donation?" Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "Perhaps because you could not bear to let it go, because that comb was tied too closely to old guilt, to your husband's death, and all the whispers that followed it." Lady Carradine's face crumpled, not into rage, but into something sadder, more exhausted. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I regretted offering it. It wasn't just a trinket. It was a reminder, a relic of all the mistakes we made abroad. When Michael won it, I panicked. I thought, if it vanished, no one would ask questions." Miss Marple's eyes softened with a kind of pity. "And so you arranged for Lucy to fetch it later, using her own fears to ensure her silence." Lady Carradine bowed her head. Miss Marple turned to Constable Truex. "I believe Lady Carradine will wish to make a full statement." Constable Truex, for once, rose to the occasion. He nodded, gently taking Lady Carradine's arm. As they departed, Lucy sank into a chair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea and handed it over with a steady hand. The village, she thought, would heal in time, but the scars left by pride, by fear, and by desperate silence, those would take longer to fade, and Miss Marple, who knew human nature as well as she knew her knitting patterns, understood that better than anyone. Chapter 9. The reveal by. The following afternoon, Little Whittington was a village divided between shock and satisfaction. Some whispered that justice had been done. Others, more cynically, mused that it was always the grandest houses that harboured the darkest secrets. But for once, no one rushed too quickly to judgment. Lady Carradine's confession had left an unease that dulled the sharp edges of gossip. Marple, however, knew the matter was not yet fully at rest. There were still murmurs, unfinished questions threading through the lanes like mist. What about the blackmail? Who had sent threats to Iris? What of the petty thefts at the library, the stolen tea service? One confession did not stitch all the fraying seams. And so, that evening at the vicarage, Miss Marple gathered the final pieces together before a small, trusted audience. Iris and Mrs. Cranley, Mrs. Barton, Constable Truick, and a rather shamefaced Lucy Trent, who had remained in the village under Miss Marple's discreet encouragement. The drawing-room was quiet, the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock marking the minutes with solemn precision. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "There are, I think, a few matters still unclear," she began mildly, "and in the interest of peace it is best to set them to rest properly." Iris glanced nervously at her mother, but Mrs. Cranley gave a small, weary nod. Constable Truick sat forward, notebook at the ready, though he looked as though he would much rather not write anything at all. Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost gentle. Lady Carradine took the comb. That much is clear. She panicked, for reasons tied deeply to her past, and manipulated events to conceal her action. Lucy Trent, fearful of her own troubles, became a convenient scapegoat. Lucy flushed, staring at her hands, but there were other wrongs, committed under the cover of the larger scandal. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Lucy, not unkindly. The missing petty cash at the library, the attempt at blackmail, those were not orchestrated by Lady Carradine. They were the acts of someone else, driven by opportunity and desperation. Lucy lifted her head, her mouth trembling. I didn't mean—" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You took the money, Miss Trent. You saw a chance to relieve your difficulties, thinking it would pass unnoticed amid the greater storm." Lucy buried her face in her hands. "I was so frightened. About London, about what people would say. I didn't want to go back. I thought if I had a little money, I could start fresh somewhere else." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "Fear drives many unwise choices, but confession is often the first step back toward peace." Constable Truick cleared his throat awkwardly. "We'll need a statement, of course, but— well, it needn't go farther than that, maybe." Monsieur Marple smiled approvingly. Truick, she thought, was learning the important difference between justice and punishment. Lucy dabbed her eyes, nodding miserably. Miss Marple turned next to Iris, and the matter of the blackmail letter. Iris's hands twisted in her lap. "You feared exposure for a youthful indiscretion, taking a little money from your mother. But the letter you received was not, I think, penned by Lucy Trent." Iris looked up sharply. "It wasn't. No," Miss Marple said gently. "The handwriting was disguised, but the method, the phrasing, was clumsy. Desperation again. Someone who feared scandal greatly. Someone who wanted to frighten you into silence without involving themselves openly." Her eyes slid calmly to Mrs. Cranley. There was a long, heavy pause. Then Mrs. Cranley gave a small, broken laugh, a sound almost of relief. "I did it," she said quietly. "I wrote the letter." Iris gasped. "Mother!" Mrs. Cranley bowed her head. "I was terrified, Iris, terrified that if you spoke up, it would all come out. The theft, the connection to Captain Arkwright. People would say terrible things about you, about our family." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her voice was steady now, stripped of pride. "I thought if you stayed silent, it would pass. I thought I was protecting you." Miss Marple's expression softened. Parents often make grave mistakes in the name of love. she said kindly, but silence rarely protects as much as it wounds. There was a quiet moment as Iris, pale and shaken, reached across and took her mother's hand. Miss Marple allowed them their moment. Then briskly she added, "As for the tea service, that too, I believe, was taken by Lucy Trent in her confusion and fear, hidden with the idea of selling it later." Lucy nodded miserably. "I hid it in the old barn near the woods. I'll show you." Constable Truick made a note, but his expression was not unkind. Miss Marple rose to her feet, smoothing her skirt. "The comb will be returned. Lady Carradine's confession will be handled discreetly. And the other matters," she glanced meaningfully at Truick, "will be resolved with, I think, compassion." Truick coughed. "Aye, quietly done." Relief swept the room, almost palpable. Miss Marple smiled. Human nature, she thought, was rarely black and white. It was a patchwork. Fear, pride, foolishness, courage, stitched together with good intentions and desperate hopes. And in Little Whittington, at least, some small stitches had been mended tonight. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Iris caught her hand. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "how did you know? How did you see what no one else did?" Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "My dear," she said, "people are much like patterns in knitting. A dropped stitch, a pulled thread. They may seem small, but if one watches carefully enough, they always reveal themselves." And with that, she departed into the cool, peaceful night, leaving behind a village a little wiser, a little quieter, and perhaps, in time, a little kinder. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The days that followed were some of the quietest Little Whittington had known for some time. The scandal over the missing amber comb, the blackmail letter, the petty thefts, all under Miss Marple's gentle guidance and Constable Truick's pragmatic handling, were smoothed over without any formal charges or public disgrace. The tea service was quietly returned to Lady Carradine's household, and Lucy Trent, after a tearful apology to the vicar and the villagers she had wronged, left Little Whittington to seek honest work with the help of an old friend of Miss Marple's in Basingstoke. It was, Miss Marple thought, a most satisfactory arrangement. Punishment, in her mind, was less about public humiliation and more about ensuring people faced their own conscience. Lady Carradine, however, did not remain. Within a week of her confession, she had shuttered Willowmead and departed for a private estate somewhere in the Lake District. Some said it was shame. Others that she simply could not bear to live among the Whispers. Either way, Willowmead stood empty now, its tall windows staring blankly across the green. Miss Marple sipped her tea one afternoon, surveying her neat garden, as she listened to Mrs. Barton recount the village's most recent developments. "I do think things will settle now, don't you, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Barton said hopefully, adjusting her hat against the mild breeze. "No more unpleasantness." Miss Marple smiled, but it was a small, private sort of smile. "One hopes, Mrs. Barton," she said gently, "but human nature being what it is, one must always be prepared for a little, shall we say, disturbance." Mrs. Barton laughed, reassured without understanding exactly why. The church bells rang out across the village, clear and sweet, in the autumn air. Down by the green, young Tommy Price kicked a football with two other boys, his laughter ringing out in bursts. Mrs. Cranley and Iris walked arm in arm, talking quietly, a tentative but real mending of old wounds. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose to tidy the garden, pausing now and again to prune a stray rose or pluck a dead leaf. She reflected, as she worked, on the curious nature of the amber comb. It had seemed such a simple thing, an ornament, a relic from a bygone age. Yet it had held within it a potent symbol of pride, of fear, of human frailty. Lady Carradine had clung to it, haunted by past mistakes. Mrs. Cranley had feared what its exposure might mean for her family. Lucy Trent had seen, not the comb itself, but the confusion around it as a means of escape. All of them had been wrong, in their own ways, and all had paid for it, not with the heavy hand of the law, but in the quiet, lingering burden of regret. As for Iris, she had learned, perhaps for the first time, that good intentions, however noble, could still lead down shadowed paths. Miss Marple knew that the lessons learned now would echo long after the gossip faded. A knock at the gate roused her from her thoughts. Iris Cranley stood there, smiling shyly, holding a small wrapped parcel. "For you, Miss Marple," she said. "To say thank you." Miss Marple took the parcel and opened it carefully. Inside was a simple embroidered handkerchief, with neat stitching around the edges. Tiny white daisies blooming on soft linen. "I made it myself," Iris said, cheeks pink. "It isn't much, but, well, Mother says you saved us." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she fingered the delicate work. "My dear child," she said, "it is quite perfect, far more valuable in its own way than any amber comb." Iris laughed softly, a sound lighter than it had been in weeks. As the girl departed down the lane, Miss Marple tucked the handkerchief into her sleeve and turned back to her garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across Little Whittington, turning the thatched roofs and stone walls to soft fire. The mist that sometimes lingered on the fields had not yet risen, and for a moment everything seemed washed clean. But Miss Marple, who understood the world all too well, knew that beneath the golden surface human nature remained. Complex, fragile, and infinitely fascinating. There would always be more secrets, more petty jealousies, more silent mistakes stitched into the daily fabric of village life. That was the way of things. And she, quietly tending her roses, listening at tea parties, and knitting while the world whirled by, would always be there, watching, understanding, and when necessary, very gently setting things right. Because wickedness, she thought, was like bindweed in a garden. It never truly disappeared. It only waited, patiently, quietly, for the right conditions to flourish again. But so too did goodness, often in the smallest, most surprising ways. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her shears snipping gently, the golden light painting the garden in soft strokes, and thus peace returned, for now, to Little Whittington, until inevitably it would not.